Kumlan and Ablat Gemara. We are learning now Monday's daf. We'll pause for a second, then we'll do Tuesday's daf, Tisha B'Av's daf as well. So we are up to the Gemara here, daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. We learned Rabbi Huna's din. Rabbi Huna comes along and makes a special halacha that says that if someone is coerced into making a sale, tell you physically hung him up, strung him up a tree. It's an expression that he was in pain. And the only way out of it is by selling something. At the end of the day, it's a proper sale because he probably relented. And we had Rabbi Bibi who argued, and he argued on the one specific exception where Rabbi Huna says that this works only if he received money. But if, for example, he gave it as a gift, he received nothing in return, then Rabbi Huna says it's not a proper gift. He was forced into it. He never meant it. Rabbi Bibi says that even if he received money, it's not a proper sale because it was done by coercion. So we are up to the Gemara over here. We discussed a few other things where we see that coercion helps. And each one of those, he received something in lieu, like a carbon, they get a kapara, and so on. By divorce, the Rishonim ask, what does he get in lieu? The divorce, isn't that like a matana? He's granting her a divorce, he gets nothing in return, and yet we see that it's that the coercion, get by a bezin, it works. So we, so the Rishonim basically, some of the Rishonim answer, because he no longer has to then provide for her the three obligations that every man has for his wife: she'er, ksus, v'oina, providing with food, providing with clothing. Since he no longer has to do that, once he gives a get, he got something in return. Other Rishonim don't like that because he didn't get anything in return. You just don't have to give something, which is not the same thing as receiving something positive. Just you no longer have to pay. So they give other explanations. We're up to the Gemara over here. Mosiv Rav Hamnuna, about 10 lines from the bottom of the page. So Rav Hamnuna will ask a question on Rav Huna, and he asks, Lokach misikrikun. Again, now we're going to delineate and bring out what we said before. We just mentioned before that the difference whether the person received money, then we will say it's a proper sale, but it didn't receive money, just verbal promises, and he was forced into it, then we say it's not a proper sale. He probably just did it, and then he expects to somehow or another go to courts or to somehow or another to retrieve it and get back his assets. So I'm going to ask a question. We discussed this yesterday. Lokach misikrikan. If a sikrikun, that's the goy, and if that was phase 3 in the history of the Roman Empire regarding the relationship with the Jewish people. So they that if they took from sikrikun, a goy who forcibly acquired a property from a yid and he's sort of under threat, and the yid, in order to spare himself, he gave him the property. But the courts at that time did not really take that. They're not allow for that. So therefore, in the back of his mind could be that the yid thought, I'll eventually take him to court and get back my property. So then another yid goes over. Let's say the owner of the property is Reuben, but Shimon then goes to this guy and purchases the property. Lokach misikrikin, but he feels sort of a little bit guilty, or he wants to make it more credible. So Chazav lo bal bayit, he then turned around and went to the original owner Reuben and he gave him, and he promised, I'm going to buy it from you as well. Mekhe bottle. The fact that he went ahead and bought it, the whole mekach is still nullified because it was done by coercion. No, but you, Rav Huna, said, you said even coercion, once you made a sale, it's a valid sale. So why, when the other came along and bought it from the original owner, do we say mekach bottle? Says the Gemara. If you remember, we had an argument between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said that this din, that we say that if you bought it from Sakrikan, the sale falls off, is only if the yid said, go ahead, buy it, fix the fences, it's yours. Then we know that he didn't really mean it. But if he documented it, that means the yid at the end relented and he gave in, and it would have been a good deal. So that means you're talking about where he didn't document it. So Gemara is like this. But Shmuel says, even if he documented it, he's just going through a ploy here. This is part of his ploy to make believe, to feign as if he actually meant it, and then he expects to go to court and get it back. So first says, according to Rav, this is all talking about can you go ahead, buy it, make your kinyan, make your chazak, and mend the fences. So then we say he didn't mean it. Aval b'shtar kana, but actually, and that's what the case in that mission is talking about the sikrikim. But if you had documented it, he would have been kind of just like Avuna said. If you documented, he was coerced, and he sold it just for the document. It's a valid sale. So you want to find. But Shmuel says that Shmuel says it seems from Shmuel that in all circumstances coercion is not a valid kinyan. So tell me, and that's pshat and that's why it's not valid. So you Rav Huna, who says it is a valid kinyan, how do you explain yourself? Ma'ikal Meimer says the Gemara. Rav Huna says very simply, as we already discussed today and yesterday, Moide Shmuel Heichad Yavzuzah. That even that if there was money that changed hands, then the Yid thinks, well, I don't really lose out. I got money instead. And then he can't say wholeheartedly, but then he accepted, he resigned himself to the sale, and it's a valid sale. So that Mishnah Sekrikan is talking about there was no money that changed hands. But Rav Huna is talking about a case where money changed hands. So therefore, even though it's done by coercion, it's a valid sale. Says the Gemara, Urabibi. What about Rabibi? What's Rav Huna going to do with Rabibi? Rabibi says even if money changed hands, since it's done by coercion, it's not a valid sale. How is Rav Huna going to deal with Rabibi? So Rabibi, the Messiah who concluded the name of Rav Nachman, Karka Ein Loi and Mois Yeshloi, that the sale falls off by the Sekrikun, and he gets his money back. This second Jew, Shimon, who went and bought it from Sekrikun, gets his money back, which sounds like that money did change hands, and yet there was no sale. Kasha Rav Huna, Ma'ikal Meimer. So, what's the problem? Rabibi Memru, Rabibi is just repeating what other Amoraim said. Rav Huna has a right to argue with these Amoraim. So at the end of the day, there's an argument between Rav Huna and Rabibi. According to Rabibi, a coerced sale is never a sale. According to Rav Huna, if there was money changing hands, or if the person received something in lieu, so then at the end he resigned himself. Said, "Look, I'm no worse off because I received something instead. I don't have a choice. I will sell." And it's a valid sale. Says the Gemara, my Rava says, Rava, so what's the final halacha? Hilcha says, so Rava comes along the final halacha, and however, we're not going to really rule like Rava because he's too limited. Rava says as follows: Hilcha, so the halacha is like Rav Huna, but in certain cases, talayu, let's say they hung him up and they threatened him, unless he makes a sale, it's a valid sale. Yeah, like Rav Huna, coercion can be a valid sale. But he goes further. But you need to show. At the end of the day, you have to do something to show us that you actually accepted or you resigned yourself to the sale. So, when do we say that? If the guy says, "Give me a field," and since you chose the field, even though it's done by coercion, so you had some input in it. So we'll say, you know what, you accepted the sale. The guy nominates a particular field and says, "This is the field that I want," and you gave it to him. And even though you received anything else, says Robert, that's not. That kind of coercion, since you had no input whatsoever, it's not a sale. So no, it's not an open-ended statement. You receive money, therefore, and you're forced into it. You're a valid sale. No, we need a little bit of input from you. And then he goes further. But when do we say that? Even but if he says this particular field, that it's not a sale when you had no input. But if you had the slightest input. It is, for example, that's only talking about you didn't count the money. You didn't count the money. That means if the guy gave you the money and you counted the money, that means it shows that you're a reluctant seller, but you accepted it, and therefore you count the money, make sure that the deals are right. Not everyone is good as the word artzi zuze. Others say artzi means that you just, acknowledge and said in front of him, in front of witness, says, yes, I accept. But most Rishonim say, artzi zuze. If you counted the money, then you had some input, then we say the sale is a valid sale. Even though the guy said, so do I want dafka that particular field. And again, when do we say that? Again, that if he says this particular field, you have, and the coercion is not a sale. There's no way you can wiggle out of it. If there's a way you're going to wriggle yourself out of it, then the fact that you decide, okay, I'll sell it, that was your little input, it's a valid sale. So Rava still makes it conditional that not always when you receive money is a valid sale. If the guy nominated Saduzu, sometimes it's not a valid sale. However, the Gemara concludes, but the halacha is not like Rava. Big kulu in all instances. The habis vinazvina. In all instances, if there was coercion, but you receive money, afila b'sadazu, even where the guy said this particular field, and money changed hands, it's a valid sale. And I'll prove it to you. In a case of a marriage, the woman is the seller and the husband is the buyer. The woman, sells herself into this relationship, and the husband who gives the money, or the three ways of getting married, through kesef or through shtar or through bia, he's the one who does the transaction. In fact, if she does the transaction, it's not a valid kedushin. He has to do kiyikach ish isha. He has to do the entire transaction. So then you have a buyer and a seller, and the din is talu v'kadish kiddush of kedushin. Now, what happens if if it was forced into a kedushin? There's a valid kedushin. So we see from here that now the man goes to this woman, wants to marry her. It's like saying sadazu. I want this woman. I don't want any woman. I want this particular woman. And she's the seller, and yet we say that the Meimer says it's a valid kedushin. So what do we see? That even if the person nominates, I want this particular thing, and then there's coercion, since you receive something in return, it's a valid sale. What does she receive in return? So the Shemari say, the promise of she'er ksus v'oina, he will provide for her and take care of her. So she's receiving something in return. So she's a seller, and therefore it's a valid kedushin. So even saduzu comes along, Gemara says, there's a very interesting Rashba in the beginning of Kedushin, where there's an argument between the Rashba and the Bala Itra, and it's along the lines we spoke yesterday, even though they don't spell it out. What happens if you force the man to marry the woman? Is it a valid Kedushin or not? Here we're saying if you force the woman, the Gemara concludes as if you force the woman, it's not a valid Kedushin for a side issue. But what happens if you forced the man to marry the woman? Is it a valid Kedushin or not? The Bala Itra says, Ma'adach, you force the woman, it's a valid Kedushin. Surely if you force the man, it's a valid Kedushin. And the Rashba says, no way, only if you force the woman, not if you force the man. And the Mefarshim tried to understand what is it's such extremities that the Balita said not only is Mekudesh, it's a koshke. Surely if you force the husband to marry her, he's Mekudesh. And according to the Rashba, he completely he says he negates it and says, no way. If you force the man, there's no condition at all. So this is based on what we said yesterday. Who is the main player when it comes to a transaction, the seller or the buyer? The main player is the seller, and we say that the woman who is forced into it is a valid marriage because she accepts, if she accepts it, then she's a valid marriage. Then surely the buyer, the husband who does very little in here, in theory, and what's actually happening is she's giving herself over, and he's doing very little. There's a beautiful Ran in the Durham Dav Chavtes that explains exactly what happens when there's a marriage between a woman and a husband, what her role is and what his role is. But these Rishonim hold that the man does very little, so surely he's Mekudesh. That's the Bala Itra. But the Rashba says no. The main person is the buyer, so we force the seller; it's a valid sale. But the buyer, you can't force the buyer, so therefore there's no sale there at all. And the way the Ram paints the picture there is that the woman sort of says like I'm in a way, in a transactional way. We'll use the words. She makes herself like hefker, and the husband then therefore does everything to make the transaction real. And that's how the Rashba looks at it, and that's how the Bala Itra looks at it. The Mashenk and the Rashba said no, she's the main party in the transaction. Says about it further, even though technically, if you're forced into marriage, she's married. Remember, even though technically he's married, but practically speaking, she's not engaged. Why not? The Rabbana step in. Who asa shalei kohagen? He did the wrong thing. Lefichach asu imach shalei kohagen. Therefore, because he did the wrong thing, we are going to take it away from him and not allow him to continue this kind of behavior. And the Rabbanon will cancel the Kedushin. Traces wants to know, when do we say, if somebody can mute himself, when do we say that if you, that the reason why the Chachamim say that you can cancel the Kedushin is because since a person gets married, called the Mekadesh, Adaita the Rabban Mekadesh, since when we get married under the chuppah, you say, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, we want to make sure this agrees with the traditions and the laws of Moshe and Yisrael. That's why the rabbis have the right to remove the marriage, to cancel the marriage. And here it doesn't say that. So Taisa basically says, where you don't follow what the Chachamim say, then we cannot use the words that because Kolam Kaddish and he did not do. You forced her, so you did not follow. We don't think that's ethically right, so you didn't follow the Chachamim. So we need to use different grounds as to why we can cancel the Kedushin. In the other place of the Gemara, where the Gemara says that that if the marriage is done right, then the reason why we cancel the marriage, if we have to, is because you married based on the rabbis agreeing to the marriage. That's the case in Hashalech, where we say that if a man sends a get with an agent to his wife, And then after he's traveling, let's say a month travels, the next week he regrets it. So he goes to the bezin and he cancels the get. But she has no idea. The shliach, has no idea. She'll get divorced and she'll get remarried. It turns out to be that she was a married woman, and the children will be mamzedim. So there, the chachamim took away the kedushin from him in the first place. The get is not a valid get because he canceled it. But we're going to say that we're never married in the first place, and there we use the expression that called the mekadosh a daijabon mekadosh, because there when they got married initially they did the right thing. It's a question of how he produced how he's presenting the get. So therefore, over there we'll use that kind of logic. Says the Gemara further. Okay, it makes sense. We take away the kedushin if kaddish bekaspa if it was done with money. But kaddish bebia ma'ikmim if it was done with bia. What are you going to say? What exactly is the difference if the method used was money, the method used was bia? So most of Shainim learn, and they completely negate the other opinion. And they say it's outlandish, but most Rishonim learn simply both are methods that the Torah recognizes as getting engaged. But when it comes to money, the rabbis have the power to be mafkir your money. So the Rabban will step in and say, the money you gave to that woman, as if it was never yours. She took it from hefker. It was ownerless money. So she never got engaged to you in the first place. But when it comes to bia, how can they do that? The fact is, there's no money changing hands. It was a bia. And then the Rabbanon say there was no marriage. It's an avera. It's nus. So what the Rabbanon can do then? The Rabbeinu Gershom here, however, learns a way that most Rishonim cancel. Rabbeinu Gershom says no. Kesef is only midrabanan, and because kesef is only midrabanan, therefore the Rabbanan can cancel that kind of marriage. But bia, which is a biblical way of getting married, how can the Rabbanan cancel it? Now, the Rambam, there's a big argument how to understand the Rambam when he says that kesef is divrei seifrim, whether he learns Rabbanan, and then all the commentators there on the Rambam basically learn the Rambam agrees with the Rashbam and all the Rishonim that say that no, that kesef is Ma'atera. But Rabbeinu Gershom here clearly says that kesef is only midrabanan. That means that it's quite possible that the Rambam, when he uses the words divrei seifrim, that he actually meant the Rabbanan. But then the question is, we learn kesef from Gzera Shava. Kicha kichem is the Ephron. If it's a Gzera Shava, then how can you say it's only midrabanan? Unless it's not a real Gzera Shava, it's only like an asmachta. So the Gemara continues. What are we going to say in bia? Amalei shavi Rabbanan will say that we are going to treat the bia in this particular case because you behaved unethically. The Chacham have the right to say that that will be oiker. We will remove something which you did mahatayr was acceptable, and we're going to cancel it in a sheva al tais. We're going to say, well, that's not a bia of marriage; it was a bia of znus. So the Gemara continues in the same theme. Tavi was a strong-armed person. Tola le pape akindre. He sort of strung up pape on this tree called kindra. Bezabin, and he had him sell him a property. Papi saw this coming, so he called in a few witnesses, including Rabbi Bar Chana, and he said, I'm giving a madah. You remember we discussed the concept of a shtar madah. Shtar madah is where you notify a few people, I know that tomorrow I'm going to make a sale, but I really don't want it. So I'm telling you right now that sale is not a valid sale. So they call it shtar madah, I'm notifying you. Even though we had an opinion rather before that says that it doesn't work unless we know precisely what the accident is, it has to be a real thing, and not the only exception was the case of the pardus, where nobody can know that, where nobody will know what that conman is doing. That was a normal case of property; everybody knows it's yours, and this guy comes along and says it's only his, and you deny it, then we won't do a shtar madah. But you go to court and fight it out. But in the case of the pardus, where it was a lender and a borrower, and they gave the lender your field for 10 years, and then we deduct every year a tenth, and there's a good likelihood that in 10 years' time, people are going to forget that he received it as a security, as a pledge, as a mashkin. Then says Rabbi, you have a right to make a midah. The Rabbi says you have a right to make a midah. Anyway, in this particular case, he knew what was happening, but others argue with Rabbi. In this particular case, he wrote a midah, but then Ashkalta, the following day when he sold the property for Tova, he used the same witnesses. The same witnesses assigned. The midah signed the sale the next day. That these Amoraim who signed the midah, they did not do the wrong thing. Those who signed the contract the following day did not do the wrong thing. Says, what do you mean? If the Maidah is valid, then then the star is not a valid star. Because you can't have both. The Maidah says there is no star. The star is useless. The star says that the Maidah doesn't exist and it's a valid sale. So how can they both be right? And the if the star is valid, then the Maidah is not valid. What does he mean? If it wouldn't have been for the Maidah, the man the chasim ashkalta shapir chasim, that the one who if you signed that contract, let's say there would have been no Mudah. You just signed the contract is valid. The guy was forced into it. Well, we pass Rav Huna that if money changed hands and he was forced into it, it's still a valid sale. So there's nothing wrong for Adam to sign that star. We're not going to say, oh, Adam, if you sign such a star, you're a shoyim. We don't say that because we just the rule like Rav Huna that if money changed hands, it's a valid sale. Rav Huna says, "Tell you, if you force someone and you sell, it's a valid sale." Said it's not so. Let me ask you a question. You're saying that what the midah and the star is all right. But Rav Nachman, did Rav Nachman say, Eidim she'amru, Eidim, let's say, sign on a star, and then they said, Amona hayidvarenu. You should know that this star was never activated, that we wrote that was a loan, but the loan hasn't happened. We just wrote in anticipation that a loan will happen. And we really discourage, in fact, we say it's the wrong thing to do because you're asking for trouble. It's like Lifnei Evil Asit Michel. Or the Gemara in Ksubas, we say you shouldn't leave in your house an Avla. And we also learn from there that you shouldn't have it in a shul, a Sefer Torah, which is puzzle. And in fact, that's the whole discussion of Yud and others. How do we have so many puzzle Sefer Torahs in our shul? When the Gemara clearly says, you shouldn't leave in your oil avla. You shouldn't leave a Sefer Torah shenamuga. That is possible. That's a separate issue. But today we say also that you should not have a star amona. So if the Eidim sign and they come along and say that this star is amona, ain't their money. We don't believe them. Now we're not talking about a case where we know that these Eidim signed the document. For sure, we don't believe them. You're changing your mind. But even if the only way we know that this star is real is because genuine, because you say yes, this is our signature, but then right away you say, but we should know that it's never activated. We still don't allow you. Why not? Because we say that in the two reasons. First of all, you're changing your argument. First, it sounds like from here because every star that's signed, the Shlokir says is Kamisha Nechtre, this is as if it's a valid star. You're standing in front of a bezin, and then you tell us it's not a valid star. So you're changing. It's like Toyim v'chayziv we had before. You're changing your argument. And the second thing is, it's the wrong thing to do. So you're painting a picture that you're a Russia. And we say that a person cannot come along and incriminate themselves. So for two reasons, you're not believed. What happens if they say, if they say that it was a Maidah, so there was a Maidah as well. In other words, the star is a valid star, but you should know the day before we signed a Maidah. Ain't the money, they're not believed. Now in this case, they're not Rishoyim. So why aren't they believed? Because they're changing their argument. Right now, we see a star in front of us. It's a valid star, authenticated. And so this is standing present and say, yes, this is what happened. And now you're coming and changing your argument and saying, yeah, but this star is no good because yesterday there was another star that gave us a notification that the star is no good. So the Gemara says, Hani mili al peh. When do we say that? When do we say that? So we're asking a question. How can you say a minute ago that the Eidim signed Medah, then they signed a star, they're both valid, when we say that you cannot, if Eidim said we had a Medah, we don't believe them. Says Gemara, when do we say we don't believe Eidim who signed the star that there was also Medah al peh? If they say verbally he told us yesterday that the star he's going to sign tomorrow, you should know is done by coercion, and I don't agree. Then we say, you have a star, a document in front of Bezin, witnesses, and then you're trying to, the same witnesses are trying to cancel it. That's you come with one argument and then you're trying to amend it. You can't do that. But if there's two documents, one document, the star you're signing, that there's a sale, and the star you signed yesterday, a star can come, there you can't, because we say, because a star can cancel the star, because both of them are valid documents. And and even though it's sort of clashing, we'll see in a minute. Gufa, let's analyze what we just said. Nachman said, Amona, the agents say it was Amona, then we say Einamon. We don't believe them. But if they say that the star is valid, but we wrote another star, which is the star Midah, Einamon, and I believe. That's what Rav Nachman said. So Amona, they're not. In both cases, they're not believed. And why aren't they believed? Because they're changing the story. Umar, but Ravashi says no. Amona, they say that Amona, that this star that looks real is not real, they're not believed. You know why they're not believed? Because they are incriminating themselves. They should never have signed such a star. It's against the rules, and therefore a person cannot incriminate themselves. We don't believe you, and that you are a Russia, and therefore the star is valid. They're not believed. But if they say, look, we signed this star. In fact, the guy himself asked us to sign the star so he can get rid of this threat. But yesterday we also signed the Maidah. And then money, they are believed. Because there's no rishus here, they are believed. What about the fact that changing the story? No. My time is he says it's not called changing the story, just adding a layer. You're not contradicting this is a valid star. And you're not contradicting that, but you're just saying there was another star that already foretold that this star is not going to be a valid star. So because there's no contradiction, you're not changing his tune. Regarding the second star, you haven't changed anything. You're just telling us there's another fact, there's another layer. So as far as that is concerned, that's good enough. But the problem is by amona. The problem by amona is that it's the wrong thing to do, and a person cannot incriminate themselves. But in the case of coercion, you didn't do anything wrong, and therefore you're not incriminating yourself, and that is why you believe.